oil is growing, especially in Asia, where the Chinese are buying millions of new cars every year. The Chinese people are buying more new cars now than Americans are. First time in history that's ever happened, and another country has surpassed the U.S. in terms of automobile purchases. Even though all of those things are happening, actual production has been flatlined, basically. This suggests that we're starting to hit fundamental limits. Even though we're bringing online all this low-grade stuff like the Canadian tar sands, the shale oil in North Dakota that has to be produced by hydrofracking, heavy oil in Venezuela, and so on. Even though we're bringing in all of this low-grade stuff, it's not making much of a difference in actual world output. You know, this is what the oil industry looked like back in the 1930s. This is what it looks like today, where so much of what's being produced is from deep water, offshore, drilling in a mile or 2 or 3 of ocean water before we even get to rock, and then another mile or 2 of rock before you get to the pocket of oil. This is a slide from the U.S. Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration. All of those nice colored bands represent all of the oil in the world that we know about. OPEC oil, non-OPEC oil, conventional oil, unconventional oil. And as you can see, right about now, all of that starts dropping off. The big, old, supergiant oil fields that were discovered in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, those are depleting and declining in production. And new production from all of these smaller and more marginal and offshore and tar sand sources are simply not enough to make up for that. But not to worry, says the U.S. Department of Energy, because we will get enough new oil to make up for rising demand from unidentified projects. Now, undoubtedly, unidentified projects will appear. But at what rate? In what number? We don't know because they're unidentified. We have a faith-based energy policy in this country. Oil is our primary energy source. It's virtually all of our transport energy, and yet we don't have a plan B. We're riding on a prayer, a wing and a prayer. Again, what's actually happening is that the cost of developing these new marginal sources is increasing at a dramatic pace. Back in the year 2000, it was possible for the industry to develop new production capacity for the investment of about $20 a barrel. It's now up in the range of, I say $80 here, but according to the latest information that I just heard in the last couple of weeks, it's more on the order of an average of about $87 a barrel. In other words, the industry needs oil prices at that level in order to justify investment in these new marginal sources. It can cost up to $500 million to drill one exploratory well in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico, and it may come up dry. That's the level of investment we're talking about. Okay? So meanwhile, we know now from experience that every time the price of oil shoots up to above $100 a barrel in inflation-adjusted terms, the economy, the U.S. economy, starts to go into convulsions. Look at this. The vertical gray bars are recessions over the past 30, 40 years, right? And the squiggly red line on top of that is oil prices adjusted for inflation. This is 2008 dollars, okay? Every time we've had an oil price spike, we've had a recession immediately follow. Now, we have had a recession or two that does not appear to be correlated with an oil price spike. So it's not true to say that oil price spikes are the only things that cause recessions. However, we don't have any instances where we've had an oil price spike without a recession immediately following. So that suggests that there's a close relationship between oil prices and recessions. Now, let's go back to this slide. It's true that if oil prices rise slowly enough, we can adapt, the economy can adapt to higher oil prices. And that does appear to be happening in the U.S. But it's not happening fast enough because the cost of developing new oil supplies is rising so much faster. Remember, I mentioned a minute ago that in the year 2000, it was only about $20 a barrel. Now it's up to $87 a barrel. Within a couple of years, it will be over $100 a barrel. So that means that if for some reason the oil price drops, maybe we go back into a serious recession like happened in 2008 and the oil price collapsed. That's what happened at the end of 2008. Once after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and the whole economy went into, this horrible situation, what happened was that killed demand for oil in the U.S. People stopped driving. Okay, and of course a lot of people lost their jobs, so they weren't driving to work anymore. So the price of oil collapsed down to about $36 a barrel temporarily. It's recovered most of that back up to over $100 a barrel today. So if that happens, then that's not a high enough price for the industry to justify more exploration, so the industry cuts back on exploration. So that means that later on supplies start dropping, which pushes the price back. We're in this situation where every time the economy starts to recover, that pushes up oil prices to the point where it caps economic recovery. The economy starts to decline again, and that allows oil prices then to drop a little bit. So then the economy can recover a little bit, but then oil prices go back. Effectively, oil prices are now a cap on U.S. economic growth. The situation is slightly different in China and some other Asian countries. They are still able to tolerate somewhat higher oil prices in the range of, let's say, $120 to $130 a barrel on a sustained basis. So what's happening is that oil demand is shifting away from the U.S. and European countries to China. China's oil demand is growing, while oil demand in the U.S. and Europe is stagnant and in some years actually declining. Well, again, this is very serious business, especially for a state like Hawaii, which is so dependent on oil for transportation, for tourism, for the importation of food, for electricity. This state generates something like 90% of its electricity from oil. So while the U.S. as a whole is extraordinarily vulnerable to high oil prices and price shocks and supply shocks, Hawaii is especially so. Food. We've created a food system in this country and globally that's overwhelmingly dependent on oil. For transporting inputs to the farm, inputs in the form of seeds, fertilizers, fuels, lubricants, all the rest. For transporting outputs from the farm, in other words, food itself, all the way to the consumer plate. Now, for the U.S. as a whole, the average food mileage is about 1,500 miles from farm to plate. What is it for Hawaii? Probably something closer to 2,500 miles. So what's happened with this fuel-dependent food system is that food prices have started moving in lockstep with oil prices, globally speaking. In fact, food prices are actually rising faster than oil prices because oil is not the only driver of high food prices. Another driver is weird weather, floods, fires, and droughts, destroying crops. So That, in turn, is impacting the stability of governments around the world, where we see nations, poor nations with quickly rising populations, typically very young populations, not many jobs, where people have to spend a very large proportion of their income on food and fuel. When suddenly food and fuel prices shoot up, these folks who may have tolerated authoritarian, autocratic regimes for decades, suddenly these people have nothing to lose. And they pour out into the streets, they topple governments. Totally understandable. Well, I've been talking about oil a lot. Oil is not the only non-renewable resource that is required for economic growth. This is just a short list of mineral resources, non-renewable resources that happen to be useful in the computer industry and the renewable energy industry. They're all getting more scarce and expensive. Well, why aren't we hearing about this? Well, what's been happening is up until about the year 2000, most of these materials were actually getting cheaper. And, of course, economists looked at this and they said, well, it's the magic of the market. Well, that's part of it. What was actually happening is we were using more and more cheap energy, and mostly in the form of oil, to dig deeper, extract lower grade ores, refine those ores, again using more cheap energy, and then globalize the whole process of resource exploration and extraction. So copper was getting cheaper. Even as we depleted the higher grade ores, the stuff was getting cheaper. Since the year 2000, most of these mineral commodities have been getting more expensive. So there are signs of scarcity. Now, okay, if depletion of energy resources, especially oil, is such a problem, well, why don't we just go out there and develop alternative energy sources? No problem, right? Well, yes, we do need to do that, but it is still a problem. We did a study at Post Carbon Institute a couple of years ago. And by the way, you can download all of our stuff free from our website, postcarbon.org. This is about a 75-page study. We looked at 18 different energy sources, and we examined them across 10 criteria. Criteria like the energy that you get back for the energy that you invest in producing energy. That's really important. You know, if it costs you as much energy to produce a unit of energy as you get out of the process, why bother? You know, so we looked at the environmental impacts, the location of the energy source, the scalability, and so on. We weren't able to identify a likely scenario in which world energy supplies are likely to grow as fossil fuels become more scarce and expensive. Certainly there are alternative energy sources that are viable and that can be developed to a much greater degree, but we can't expect the total amount of energy available to society to increase as we make this transition. Moreover, many of the alternative energy sources have fundamental characteristics different from fossil fuels. With fossil fuels, you just, burn the stuff at whatever rate whenever you need it. Whereas some of the alternative energy sources like solar and wind are intermittent. The sun isn't shining all the time, the wind isn't blowing all the time, so you have to make allowance for that. You have to have energy storage capacity, or you have to rebuild the grid in ways that will balance loads and so on. Well, I've talked a lot about debt and depletion. What about the third D, disaster? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that has a lot to do with weird weather, with climate change. Also has a lot to do with industrial accidents. This is an amazing photo of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe of 2010. What's happening is that the cost of these disasters is growing. Why should that be? We've always had disasters. We've always had nasty weather events and accidents and earthquakes and so on. Well, A couple of things are happening. First of all, we're seeing increasing impacts from climate change.